So now we find ourselves in Isaiah chapter 46, continuing this section here where God is really challenging the unbelievers, challenging the idolaters, challenging those who turn to other gods beside him. In this particular chapter, we can divide it really into half. Verses 1 through 7 are talking about the Babylonian idols. They're a burden and they're powerless is the main message here. And then in verses 8 through the end of the chapter, 8 through 13, says God has proven himself to be trustworthy and he could be trusted to fulfill his covenant obligations, his covenant promises. So this is a what's called a polemic argument against idolatry. God is really ridiculing, making fun of the idols here and holding them up to ridicule so that his people would realize how ridiculous it is to trust in anything besides the Lord. Now, of course, during this time, we're talking about what we would imagine to be literal idols, right? Statues, carved wood, carved stone, some of them large, most of the time pretty small, statues that would fit into the niche of a house or into the niche of a temple. And these would be, pint-sized idols, I guess we'd say, pint-sized gods. And God is ridiculing them. Let's look at these first few verses. It says, Bel bows down, and Nebo stoops. Their idols are on beasts and livestock. Well, these are particular idols of Babylon. Bel is like the head god, the lead god of the Babylonian group of gods, idols. Sometimes we hear his name echoed in the names of leaders from Babylon, like Belshazzar. He's named after this god. Nebo, on the other hand, is as I understand it, a son of Bel and also a prophet of Bel. So we see often also the name Nebo embedded in the names of some of their rulers, such as Nebuchadnezzar. So we see these Babylonian gods controlling Babylon, Bel determining, Nebo revealing, and God is holding them up to ridicule. They're idols that are being dragged around on the back of a wagon by beasts and livestock. These things you carry are borne as burdens on weary beasts. So God is pointing at these things and saying, these are nothing more than cargo in a wagon. They stoop, they bow down together, they cannot save the burden, but themselves go into captivity. So basically what God is saying here is that these are idols who are unable to save. They've got to be carried around, they're going to be carried into captivity, and they are impotent. They cannot save at all. Verses 3 and 4, it says, God does not need to be saved. So this is a contrast here. These gods of the Babylonians, they need to be carted around, they need to be saved, but not the God of Israel. Listen to me, O house of Jacob, all the remnant of the house of Israel. Look who's being addressed here. The remnant. The remnant needs to be strengthened. The remnant needs to be reminded, and God is doing that in his grace. Who have been born by me from before your birth, carried from your womb. So on the one hand, in verse 1, these gods, Bel and Nebo, are being carried. But in verse 3, it's the God of Israel who carries his remnant with him. He's the one who carries the burden. He's the one who is bearing his nation. Even to your old age I am he. To your gray hairs I will carry you. I have made, I will bear, I will carry, and will save. Look at that assertion at the end of verse 4. I have made, I will bear, I will carry, and I will save. This is God's pledge. This is the God that Israel serves, not the gods, the fake gods, the false gods of the Babylonians who have to be carried around in carts. This is a God who carries his people, who cares for them. My mind runs to Jesus inviting us to bear his burden is light, his yoke is easy, he says. To whom will you liken me? So in verses 5 through 7, God is challenging them to basically not imagine him as one of these idols, not to think of him as if he were like the gods of Babylon. He is totally other, totally apart, and he's going to correct them on this. He says, to whom will you liken me and make me equal and compare me that I may be alike? Those who lavish gold from the purse and weigh out silver in the scales, hire a goldsmith and make it into a god. Then they fall down and worship it. They lift it to their shoulders. They carry it. They set it in its place, and it stands there. It cannot move from its place. If one cries to it, it doesn't answer or save him from his trouble. So God, again, he's ridiculing these golden idols, puts them up on a stand, puts them in a niche in the wall. They bow down before him. These idols never answer. They never speak. Yes, as I said before, there's malevolent forces, there's spiritual forces at work in the background, but God is asserting that he is the only God. He is the one who should be worshipped. He is the one who is to be honored and glorified, in him alone. So we have a call to action then, beginning in verse 8. So after he's ridiculed these gods, he's held them up to be the ridiculous gods they are, he calls his people, he calls his remnant to action. Remember this and stand firm. Recall it to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things of old, for I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me. Stop there for a moment. When God calls us to remember, to recall, in the ESV that I'm reading here, he repeats remember again. It's to remember, not only to call to mind, but to call to action. It's to remember the covenant that he's made and to act on that covenant, to stand firm in that covenant, to not waver from that covenant. When God calls his people to remember, he calls them not just to call things to mind, but to act on them. To be not only hearers of the word, as James will say in James chapter 1, but doers as well, and not deceiving themselves. It says, I am God and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times, things not yet done. Again, God calls on the witness of fulfilled prophecy here, calls on the witness of his prophetic word to build up his people and to give them confidence, to cause them to remember all the promises that he's made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, calling them to remember that he has declared the end from the beginning, that he is going to cause it to happen. He says, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish my purpose. These are great words of comfort to those who are faithful, and great words of dread should strike fear in the hearts of those who resist God, because he will accomplish all his purpose, not just some. Verse 11 then, he goes back and he's speaking again of Cyrus, I think, but Cyrus in a different vein. Earlier, he was God's servant, a Mashiach, surprisingly enough, kind of a Messiah of Cyrus, that God has called him to be his servant. And now he's characterized as a bird of prey from the east, the man of my counsel from a far country. I have spoken and I will bring it to pass. I have purposed and I will do it. Again, he's affirming that he's bringing Cyrus as if he was a carrion-eating vulture. He's going to be picking over the kingdoms and the nations. It's going to be a tool in God's hands to carry out God's purposes. And he says, I have purposed it, and I will do it. Then he goes on to say, again, this call to action here. Verse 12, listen to me, you stubborn of heart, you who are far from righteousness. I will bring my righteousness. It is not far off, and my salvation will not delay. So I think in the immediate term here is in view the liberation that's going to be brought by Cyrus. It's going to release the people from their captivity. They'll be returning to the land. You could read about that in the books of Nehemiah, the book of Ezra. But we also find, for example, in the book of Malachi, that as soon as the people returned to the land, not long after, they were dismayed. They were again wandering from the Lord. They again needed to be reminded, and God will remind them. But look what he closes in verse 13. I will put salvation in Zion for Israel, my glory. Again, God's promise here that salvation will come. It will come to his people, and it'll be for his glory and not for theirs. Just as our salvation is for God's glory and not for our own. He doesn't lift us up as if we deserve glory, but by saving us, he lifts himself up, and we give glory to the Lord. And as we share him with others, we invite others to contribute to his glory, to honor him, and to worship him. So God bless you, brothers and sisters, and keep these things in mind, that God can be trusted. God will carry out the purposes of his will, and ultimately, through all history, bring glory to himself.